Welcome back to the second last lecture of this semester. So we're getting very much towards the end. Today, really, we're talking about the power of platforms, of course. So we've talked about already these questions about, the structures of online publics. We've talked, of course, in the weeks before that about the way that journalism organizations, journalists themselves are arranging themselves in a social media environment. Today, really, we're going a bit deeper into the question of platforms themselves. What is the power that they have over this emerging, constantly transforming media environment? How are they particularly, of course, interacting with journalism, with news organizations, with journalists, and what power do they have ultimately over news, over journalism, over the journalism industry? That's been something of a sore point, I guess, for the last 10, 15 years or so, really, since we've seen news move into social media environments. And it's an ongoing battle, really, between news organizations and platforms, sometimes more friendly, sometimes not so friendly, as you'll see from what I'll talk about today. And then really, next week, of course, we'll wrap things up and think a bit more broadly again about this, in the book, what I've called a social news media network, the sort of the intersection, the interweaving of news media, social media, in a very networked form, of course. And that'll be the last lecture for this semester. So let's talk a bit about the power of platforms. And what I'll do today is, on the one hand, go through the key points, I guess, from the reading that I've given you for today, which was a piece by James Mees and Eddie Hercombe that talks about the interrelationships, particularly between Facebook and news outlets, with a bit of a focus on Australia, but really this applies right around the world. And then I'll talk about a case study of a very interesting, controversial, concerning event that happened about a year and a half ago in Australia as well, when the government tried to introduce a new law that was trying to address, I guess, the power of these platforms. And in fact, that's now also going to be tried in Canada and a number of other countries. So it'll be interesting to see over the next few months how that plays out there as well. But let's start with the piece by James Mees and Eddie Hercombe. And really, this echoes a lot of what we've talked about, or really across the course of this semester, of course, that by moving into the social media space, by moving onto social media platforms, that gives platforms a great deal of additional power that can, to an extent, force, I guess, journalistic organizations, news media organizations, to shape how they operate based on platform logics, based on the logics of social media, to work no longer in the way that they've always worked and produce news in the way that they've always produced news, but to produce news in such a way that it's successful on social media, economically successful, in terms of attention successful, so that it reaches audiences, it reaches users on social media, and they ideally continue to transmit that content as well via their own networks. So that's really the fundamental challenge that news media have faced, obviously, over the last 10, 15 years or so, perhaps, since they've really started to join social media in earnest. And that's the challenge that we'll look at today, really from the perspective of these interrelationships between platforms and news outlets. And I think what the article I've given you, what's really useful about that is that it goes through a number of kind of key steps, particularly in the context of Facebook, which of course is perhaps the most important platform in all of this. They're going through a number of key steps in the kind of chronology of Facebook and news intersecting, interacting with each other. So obviously there's a kind of a long prehistory, and we've talked quite a bit about that in sort of the middle of this semester, I guess, when we talked about the way that both news organizations as organizations, but also individual journalists have started to move into social media, onto Twitter, onto Facebook. And that was really a time of experimentation, I guess, just to build a presence, to perhaps create their Facebook pages, to create services on Facebook that would provide news and so on. That was really an early period of experimentation that perhaps wasn't quite so commercialized yet, but gradually then Facebook obviously also in other platforms picked up on the fact that news now was suddenly a key aspect of what happened on its platform. So for a while, from 2013 onwards, Facebook changed the way that its platform algorithm works to make news content, particularly from major news outlets, more visible on people's timelines, on people's feeds. So that was beneficial, I guess, to an extent for the news outlets, because it meant that their content was more visible than perhaps just people's social updates or whatever, and of course perhaps was seen as a positive for them. Gradually then Facebook started to experiment with more specific platform options that were targeting the news industry directly, and that's kind of the key one of these is probably Facebook Instant Articles. You may not have heard of Facebook Instant Articles before, but you've almost certainly seen them if you've been on Facebook, anytime over the last almost 10 years now, I guess. So the idea here was to not have people see a link to a news article just appear on their Facebook feeds that they then had to click on and go to another site outside of Facebook to read the article, but to basically be able to read the article directly there on Facebook. And for Facebook, that's obviously of interest because it keeps people on the platform. They don't go away and then perhaps don't come back to Facebook. For the news outlets, it was seen as perhaps interesting as well because it might mean that their article gets read rather than just the headline that you see on Facebook that people might scroll past. It's a lot easier for people just to click on that, stay on Facebook, read the full article. And so for news organizations too, this was seen in some ways as a positive that people would encounter the entire article and be able to see that. However, of course, it also meant that if people stay on Facebook and don't go to the site, the news site itself, then Facebook makes the money ultimately from the advertising that's displayed around the article, or on the news feed and so on. The platform, the news outlet no longer makes any money from the ads that it might have on its site because fewer people are going to that site. So in terms of economic measures, essentially this is a benefit for Facebook, not so much for news organizations. And of course, news organizations pretty quickly work that out as well. Also around that time, of course, and this is the time of the US election that brought Donald Trump to power, it's the time around Brexit and so on, more and more, of course, there was also a lot of increased criticism of Facebook for spreading mis and disinformation, or not so much itself spreading it, but being a platform where mis and disinformation spreads. So Facebook was seen much more critically, perhaps, in that sort of context as well. And then something curious happened, and Facebook at some point just decided, well, actually, articles, text is so last year, let's move more into video, let's move more into audiovisual content. That became known as the pivot to video, and essentially meant that video content would now be much more visible in the Facebook news feed, in the timelines that users would see, than ordinary textual content. So that's a real problem, of course, for news producers that had banked on instant articles, that have expected for their news content to be really widely visible on the platform. That was no longer the case unless the news content that they provided was in the form of videos. And so that meant that pretty quickly, because this wasn't particularly well foreshadowed or pre-announced by Facebook, pretty quickly news outlets now also had to pivot to video if they wanted to still be very visible on Facebook. They laid off staff who were producing ordinary news for Facebook, producing instant article content for Facebook, and hired a lot of video producers. And again, if you've been on Facebook over the last few years, you might have seen an increase in these sort of short video pieces that not just TV stations were producing, but also, newspapers and websites, news websites were producing, that they suddenly had all of these little 1-minute, 2-minute video snippets that they were starting to put up on their sites, but also on Facebook, because that was playing to the Facebook algorithm, basically. But also at the same time, it turned out that the metrics that Facebook provides for engagement with news, with video overall, including news video, were very severely inflated. So while Facebook was saying, yeah, let's you all publish more video, go ahead and do that, and you'll get far more engagement, that turned out to be not true. The numbers were simply wrong, basically. I don't even want to go into whether this was a malicious thing by Facebook to try and shape things in certain ways or just an honest error, but simply the video metrics weren't right. And so all of these outlets that were pivoting to video because they thought they'd get more visibility that way, they'd get more people actually viewing these videos, clicking on those videos, turned out that that wasn't actually the case when you looked at the real numbers rather than the numbers that Facebook had provided. So a bit of a problem there. And then really, just to complete this, Facebook moved away from instant articles as well. That, of course, meant that whatever staff were still producing them, whatever investment was still being made into instant articles, was now kind of in vain as well, because Facebook was no longer actually really particularly highlighting those instant articles in people's feeds, timelines. So again, all of that investment, all of that effort, put into creating these types of articles, this kind of content, was kind of pointless now. In part, this pivot away from instant articles was probably also because of all those attacks for spreading mis and disinformation, because of course the people producing instant articles were not only mainstream proper news outlets, but to some extent also the spreaders of mis and disinformation, fringe news sites and so on, that were using this to make themselves look respectable and spread their false information. So one of the reasons that Facebook generally is sort of moving away from highlighting news in people's timelines is because it simply can't be sure if that's real news or fake news or something in between, basically. So it would rather perhaps not highlight news overall, even proper news from quality outlets, because then it doesn't have to deal with making that distinction between proper news and more problematic mis and disinformation. And so that's then the next step, that now we've kind of come almost full circle, and news is no longer particularly highlighted in people's timelines, but social content from your network, from the people around you, is being highlighted. So Facebook has changed, back and forth over time, obviously, putting more news in, putting instant articles in, putting more video in, taking video out again, taking instant articles out again, taking news out again overall, and it can do that basically at the click of a button. Essentially, it can just change the way that its timeline algorithm works and what it privileges, what it prioritizes, and the news organizations, of course, that provide content, that publish content on Facebook, can't do anything about it. They simply have to live with whatever Facebook decides it wants to do. And that's not a good position for them to be in, of course, because in order to feed content to Facebook, they've got to have the staff producing it, of course. So if they invest in people who produce instant articles and instant articles suddenly go away, then they've invested a lot of money for nothing. If they invest in video and video suddenly goes away, then they've invested a lot of money for nothing. And that's really been the experience now a number of times over with all of this. And that's clearly causing quite a bit of bad blood between Facebook and the news publishers. But again, Facebook is the multi-billion-dollar, transnational monolith that it is, and the news publishers just don't have the bargaining power to change that in any meaningful way. So they simply are beholden to whatever Facebook decides it wants to focus on. That's not entirely unlikely given everything that we know. If Facebook suddenly decides that everything needs to be in the metaverse rather than just in your Facebook feed, then again, news publishers will probably just have to live with that. There's nothing they can do about it. There's nothing that they can do to change Facebook's mind in all of this. And that's really been, a fundamental problem for them. So yeah, maybe we'll go into the metaverse. Maybe Mark Zuckerberg will have some other idea of what he wants to do next. But essentially, it's kind of unpredictable what might happen. And while we've talked here about Facebook, of course, with all of that, if you think again about what's been happening just over the last few weeks over at Twitter, since Elon Musk has taken over, with all of these very random decisions that he keeps making, the same might happen there as well. He hasn't particularly, I don't think, targeted news content yet, but of course he could also say, well, all news publishers now need to jump through some hoops in order to publish content on the platform, or we'll just remove all links to outside content from Twitter or whatever. All of that would be possible technically to do, and it's really ultimately, particularly with Twitter right now, just at the whim of a single person who owns the thing. With Facebook too, ultimately it comes back to Mark Zuckerberg, although there perhaps are a few more checks and balances and a few other people who make decisions as well. But essentially it is those individuals who control information flows for literally billions of people. And that's probably not the best situation to be in. And I think we're seeing that very clearly at the moment, with Twitter particularly. Just to, by the way, give you a bit more of an idea, this is what Facebook's own promotion for instant articles looked like. And you see there, they work, of course, a lot with metrics there. 20% more clicks, 70% less likely to abandon the article once they've clicked on it, 30% more shares. That, of course, all sounds very attractive to a publisher. Yes, I'd like to have more clicks. Yes, I'd like to have more readers. Yes, I'd like to have my content shared more. But again, are these metrics true? How would we know? Only Facebook knows if these metrics are in fact accurate or not. And that's, again, part of the problem. But this turned out to be very attractive. And people, did this for a while until Facebook decided, okay, we're no longer doing instant articles, or we're kind of no longer prioritizing them. And then, things went away again. So that's the sort of the instant article kind of idea. And you see there essentially what an instant article looks like, by the way, as well. You've got there in someone's newsfeed basically just the headline, the headline of the article itself. And then when you click on it, you see within Facebook the full article itself. So that's the logic of instant articles, basically. So that's how it was kind of promoting this in, April 2016. And yeah, the image is a bit disturbing, I think. In the online version, the eyes even flicker, which is even more disturbing. But, I guess the point of this is, again, that, this is an article about, obviously, the metrics being wrong. So the big lie behind the pivot to video, but also, again, it's interesting that this really very directly connects it to Mark Zuckerberg as the person behind all of this, as the person who ultimately is responsible for all of this. And because I took a screenshot just recently, of course, you've got Elon Musk there in the recommended for you piece as well. So again, it points to the importance of these individual CEOs who have practically total control over their companies. And that may not be the best situation to be in, obviously. So that's just for background, really, and just to show you that disturbing image. So there we go. Now, the problem, of course, for publishers is, through going through all of this pain with Facebook, maybe, the idea is maybe to diversify and seek audiences elsewhere as well, not just rely on Facebook to bring your audiences to you, and then even still for doing that, take all the advertising money. So, the problem here is ultimately that publishers, of course, need to work out, how are we part of social media? How do we do with this? And in fact, who's even doing that? So this, I think, is a very illustrative quote from one of the interviewees in the article I've given you. Sort of this social boom, the company were like, oh, there's this social thing, we should be part of it. And then just approached this person and said, well, do you want to sort of lead it? And he, I think, said, I had no experience in it, but I was like, well, why not? So that's how a lot of these news outlets kind of walked into social media, basically, by saying, yeah, okay, probably got to do something. Is there a young person around who maybe knows something more about social media? Let's give it to them and they can sort it out. That's literally how it happened in most of these cases. Without a lot of forethought, without a lot of strategic knowledge or any kind of background knowledge really about how social media work either. And of course, again, at first it looked really strong because you could see the metrics and say heaps of reach and engagement. So these are, I think, Australian interviews, so they sound very Australian. Heaps of reach, heaps of engagement. There are like simple things. If you put up a photo gallery, Facebook would deem every swipe of the photo, every click on a photo within that gallery as engagement. So your reach and engagement would be phenomenal. In terms of platform metrics, of course. But what we could ask immediately is, well, does that mean anything? You know, okay, the metrics look great, but does that mean real engagement, not just measured engagement, but does it mean that audiences are really in some form engaged with your content or with your news brand? Maybe not. Maybe this is just inflated numbers because Facebook is calling every click on a photo engagement and counts that separately. And then, well, the algorithm changed and it just didn't reach the same audience that it previously did. I'd probably actually say it might have reached the same audience. It might just have generated different numbers, of course, in this particular case. But this is the sign, how quickly the algorithm can change, and overnight suddenly your numbers look very different. And then the move maybe gradually was already away from just relying on Facebook and relying more on SEO. That's search engine optimization. So that's basically making your content more visible to people who are not coming in via Facebook, but who are coming in via search on Google or somewhere else. So we hadn't done that before because we were that focused on social. We just didn't care enough about SEO. But now there's this idea of maybe diversifying. So not just relying on Facebook. Maybe people will find the story in some other way as well. And yeah, this is sort of the positive spin on this. We all rode the wave of mass reach and awareness and got a foothold, so that now the audience now knows us, maybe, but is the audience still coming in if they can no longer find this content so easily on Facebook? We might, again, ask some critical questions there of whether even now in these interviews, the people who are speaking here really quite understand the logic of social media and the pitfalls of relying on social media metrics there as a measure of genuine engagement, genuine success for your stories. And of course, as I've said, you know, they might have then moved from Facebook to other platforms or kind of try to find audiences via other platforms. But if it's not Facebook, then maybe it's Google. And then suddenly you've got to deal with Google's logic and Google's way of making money from your content, obviously, as well. And Google's changes to search algorithms, to the way it deals with search engine optimization and so on as well. Or it's Instagram, or it's Messenger, or it's WhatsApp, or it's TikTok, or whatever else, basically. So, you know, each of these platforms will work differently from Facebook, yes, but will in a very similar way also implement what it thinks is right for its community, for its users, in terms of the platform algorithms, of course. And as it does so, you might be free from Facebook to an extent, but you're still beholden to the algorithms of these platforms. So it's kind of just choosing a different partner to work with, and that partner may be just as problematic as Facebook has been. So it doesn't in itself reduce the dependency on platforms. It reduces the dependency on Facebook, but creates new dependencies on other platforms. And maybe the idea here is that if you balance your dependency across these different platforms, then none of them individually is quite so important anymore. But having said that, of course, Facebook particularly is where people still are, even if they don't use it all that actively, and even if there's subsets of the population who are much more active on other platforms. You know, Facebook is still very much a big connecting point that drives a lot of traffic ultimately. So you can't completely ignore it. You're not going to make up what you lose if you move away from Facebook by going to WhatsApp or TikTok, for instance. And yeah, we can talk about this as sort of a permanent crisis, but what James and Eddie kind of say in this is, well, we should probably understand journalism as constantly in flux, constantly changing, home to a variety of actors with competing motivations. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. If you think back really across the semester of what we've covered here as well, the way that journalists, news organizations have very grudgingly at first adopted these platforms and tried to find a way to arrange themselves with them and so on. It's never settled in any way, basically. It's never kind of got to a point where this is just normal now and it's not changing anymore, because the platforms keep changing, if nothing else, and of course journalism keeps changing as well. The tools and technologies through which we communicate keep changing. But in some ways that's always been true. That's been true well before social media. That's been true when the web first came along, even before social media. It's been true when email first came along, before the web. It's been true when cable TV first came along, when TV itself first came along, when radio came along, when newspapers came along. So all along the way, basically, journalism has kept innovating, kept changing, kept reinventing itself, because the environment in which it operates has kept changing, of course. Nothing's ever stood still. So this is maybe just the latest of a long series, a century-long series perhaps, of transformations to commercial industrial journalism. And so that's maybe a way to look at it as well. So as they say, news media organizations kind of churn through strategies as they move from one possible solution to another. They never have the time to kind of sit back and really very strategically think about what's best for us. They constantly have to adapt to new environments. And as they say, particularly with online technologies, the web and social media, there's a consistent narrative of conservatism, that's that sort of grudging acceptance of these new technologies, of change and departure. So this has been an ongoing process, a process that never stands still, of change that we've seen over the past 20, 30 years by now. And part of the problem, I guess, here possibly is that often this is driven by junior staff, because the more senior staff are often quite conservative in journalism. They don't necessarily get the new technologies, partly because of that as well. So it's the junior staff who experiment, who try and adopt and adapt to new technologies, and will perhaps then also spread them in the news organization. We've seen that again throughout the semester as people have adopted blogs, as they've adopted social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, as they've brought in live blogs and all these sorts of things as well. So they're the ones who often drive change in these organizations, sometimes very much against the resistance of the senior editors, basically. And of course, in addition to that, we've seen these new entrants, these new companies that come along as well, from independent kind of bloggers and everything else to the BuzzFeeds and Huffington Posts and so on of this world, that innovated with the form and function of journalism and tried something different in born digital kind of platforms as well. So that's sort of the story really of this semester as well, not just the story of this particular lecture. And of course, sometimes these models simply fail. So when that happens, and when they've invested a lot in some technology that didn't work, a lot of news organizations, for instance, maybe 5 or so years ago, maybe almost 10 years ago now, invested a lot in creating their own apps on smartphones and tablets and so on. And a lot of that just wasn't particularly successful, frankly, because people just saw all this stuff on social media, saw it on the web, and didn't necessarily want to download an app for every news source that they might be reading. So when that fails, then they move on from there and do something else again, basically. And that's sort of the story that we've seen over and over again as well. So yeah, the slightly downcast version of this is then to say they've never really truly adapted to the online environment. They've never really quite come to terms with it. And as institutions, they kind of keep scrabbling around for something that might work for a while and then move on to the next solution, basically. And that's probably not the best way of working, obviously, but it might be the only way that they have. It's not a particularly economically sound way of working, because you spend a lot of money on things that in 2-3 years might be obsolete. So that's the way that things have gone over the last 10, 20 years or so. And because, of course, this is hemorrhaging a lot of money ultimately, it's costing a lot for news organizations without necessarily producing great returns. Increasingly, there has been that kind of question of whether there's a need for government intervention in this. So right now, of course, with news on social media platforms, it's the platforms that make most of the money from that, because they're the ones that are running the ads on the platforms themselves. They're the ones that are making money from those ads. So the news organizations only see a small subset of that, and particularly if people are just seeing the news on the social media platforms, but not clicking through to go to the news outlets themselves, the news outlets make very little money from advertising on their own sites anymore. And that's a problem because, of course, that's really ultimately what finances news production, what finances journalism. So there is a very credible question here, whether governments should actually get involved more and kind of make social media platforms share more of their revenue with the people who produce the content that circulates on those platforms, and that's in part, of course, news organizations. So that's a really interesting question, and to explore that a bit further, what I want to do, so in the second part of this, is to look at a particular case study from Australia. And I'm not so much choosing it because it's from Australia and that's where I'm based, but because it is globally one of the first really major cases where a government has tried to make platforms pay more for news to news publishers. Without kind of wanting to give you a spoiler alert, it didn't work so well ultimately. I think it's a really useful case study to show the power of platforms ultimately, and maybe the limits of government power, but even by comparison to these massive multi-billion operations like Facebook and Google and others. So let me go through that a little bit and give you a bit of an outline of what happened there. So what we're really talking about here is what's called the News Media Bargaining Code. Or, in the longer version, the News Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code, if you like. So this was a new code, a new law, ultimately, that the Australian government wanted to create, which basically would force the social media platforms to bargain, to negotiate with news businesses to establish a fair level of payment for the news that circulates on social media. I'll just say that again. So the idea is here to make social media platforms bargain, negotiate with news outlets, so that news outlets would get a fair share of the revenue, of the advertising income that social media platforms were generating by displaying news content on their platforms. Does that make sense? So it's siphoning off, basically. It's taking some of the advertising money away from social media and giving it to news platforms. This was the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which is a government authority responsible for regulating the media and regulating communications platforms, is one of the Australian institutions involved in overseeing this. It was first developed, though, by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which is basically an antitrust watchdog, which is also an Australian government authority. And you see there a bit of the timeline. So the first ideas were launched in May 2020 with submissions from the industry, from the general public, from platform providers and so on, invited by the end of July. Draft legislation then being published at that point as well. A further round of submissions and commentary on this by the end of 2020. And then legislation was scheduled to be introduced into Parliament in February for a final approval by Parliament on the 25th of February. So that's the timeline from mid-2020 to February 2021, basically. And that's sort of how things sort of started to unfold. As this started to happen, as the government was getting real about trying to develop this law, this legislation, and introduce it into Parliament, the platforms, of course, were not reacting particularly positively to this, as you can probably imagine. Google, for instance, showed up these sorts of notes whenever you try to search for something, saying the way Aussies use Google is at risk. Your search experience will be hurt by new regulation, without necessarily, saying all that much more about how exactly it would hurt this. But essentially, the argument, of course, was, well, that's taking money away from us, so we can't run our services effectively as we would want to, and so on. So that's Google, and that's a fairly generic sort of threat, I guess, that is, of course, not directed so much here at the policymakers or news organizations, but at the general public, saying your government is going to do something really bad and something wrong, so write to your government and make them stop it, please. Facebook was a lot more explicit in its response. By August, as you see there, 2020, the managing director of Facebook Australia New Zealand was saying this draft regulation misunderstands the dynamics of the internet. It will do damage to the very news organizations the government is trying to protect. The regulation is ignoring important facts, most critically the relationship between the news media and social media, and which one benefits most from the other. So basically it's saying, well, we're not the bad guys here. We're giving this free service to news media to distribute their news. They should be happy with that and not lamenting about how much money we make by doing so. But then it goes on, and this is the critical bit. It says, assuming this draft code becomes law, we will reluctantly stop allowing publishers and people in Australia from sharing local and international news on Facebook and Instagram. So that's basically saying no more news on our platforms. We will just not allow news on our platforms, full stop, by news organizations, but also by ordinary people. So that's kind of the nuclear option, if you like. That's basically saying, well, if you do that, then no more news on Facebook or Instagram. That's the Facebook statement, which is a lot more explicit in its threat, basically, of what they might do. And of course, the government responded to this. This is an article from a media site, a kind of media monitoring site, and it basically cites the chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which obviously drafted the legislation, saying, well, that's ill-timed, misconceived, pointing to Facebook's role in spreading important information during the global pandemic, which of course is still going on, and saying, well, Facebook already pays a little bit for news content, so the code aims to bring fairness and transparency to Facebook and Google's relationship with Australian news businesses. And then it kind of goes on, and this is interesting because it says, well, according to the 2020 Digital News Report, 39% of Australians use Facebook for general news and 49% use Facebook for news about COVID-19. So the argument that they're making is basically news on Facebook is really important to Australians. So Facebook are not going to remove all of that, are they? But Facebook then really responds to that by saying, well, what you're saying, what you're assuming is that we benefit from having all this news on our platform. But the reverse is true. News represents a fraction of what people see in their news feed and is not a significant source of revenue for us. So in other words, they're basically saying, look, yeah, sure, news on Facebook might be important to the Australian people, but having news on Facebook is not important to Facebook. There's a lot of other things that people do with the platform. So this is kind of a fundamentally different understanding about what the importance of news is on Facebook and who it's important for. The government's saying, well, it's important for Australians, so it must be important to Facebook. Facebook saying, well, yes, it's important to Australians, not really important to us, so we can easily remove it and nothing else is going to happen. So that's sort of the situation by the end of August, start of September, basically. The government also got involved, of course, as they do, and said, well, this is just a bluff. We're not playing poker here. We're not in an environment where we're ever going to be persuaded by heavy-handed predictions or bluffs. So basically saying, well, yeah, Facebook, they're just being noisy, but they're not going to do it, essentially. Except they did. So this is the page of ABC, of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is our major public broadcaster. And from the 18th of February 21 onwards, that's what it looked like. No news on a news page. No news, no new news, but also none of the posts that they had posted already over the past, 5 or 10 years that they'd been on Facebook. All gone. If you were trying to access a particular post that contained a news story, this is what you'd say. This content isn't available at the moment. And while it says it's usually because the owner only shared it with a small group of people or changed to conceal or it's been deleted, of course, in this case, that wasn't the reason. The reason was that Facebook had just made it unavailable. If you were trying to post news links yourself, you took an article from the ABC and tried to post it to your own followers, your own profile, this is what you'd see. This post can't be shared. In response to Australian government legislation, Facebook restricts the posting of news links and all posts from news pages in Australia. Not just that, but globally, the posting and sharing of news links from Australian publications is restricted. So even if you were in Switzerland and you had a link to a news post, a news article from Australia, you couldn't share that either. So there you go. But then it gets even weirder because it's not just genuine news organization, but things like that. The page of the Bureau of Meteorology, which isn't a news organization, obviously, but it has kind of news-like content, if you like. The weather, particularly in a place like Australia where we get storms and bushfires and all sorts of things all the time, is newsworthy. So, it kind of showed up as Newsy, I guess, in Facebook, and so all of its content was gone as well. And not just that, but also government health organizations. In this case, Queensland Health, the state health organization, which again isn't obviously a news outlet, a news organization, but particularly in the middle, at the height of a global pandemic, has a lot of posts that are newsworthy. So that too was gone. And that's perhaps the most problematic because, of course, what Queensland Health and the other state and federal health services around Australia were doing during this time was to update people on current infection rates with COVID-19, on where to get vaccinated, on where to get tested, on changes to isolation rules and so on. So all of this was critically important in the middle of a pandemic, of course. But that too was gone. So that's, again, what I'd call the nuclear option. That is a very, very severe restriction of not just news content in a formal and literal sense, but anything that's broadly newsworthy as well on the platform. Now, Facebook did restore some of these pages, like Queensland Health, like the Bureau of Meteorology, eventually, because of the kind of public response to this, obviously, but news content remained unavailable for quite a bit longer. So this is starting on the 18th of February, and if you remember back to the image I showed earlier, on the 25th of February was when this legislation was meant to be approved by Parliament. So this is kind of a week before then, obviously, just to say, well, you seem to be going ahead with this. If you are, here's what's happening. So that's a pretty drastic action to take in order to suppress, ultimately, a legitimate government from doing legitimate lawmaking. And it, I guess, shows the power of a platform like Facebook and what it can do and what it can get away with as well. So before I get to what happened then, I wanted to show you a little bit here of the impact that this has as well. So, of course, and as I've said, I think, before in this semester as well, we don't actually have great data access to what happens on Facebook at the best of times, unfortunately. What we do have access to is a platform called CrowdTangle, which is ironically operated by Facebook as well, and which provides data on what happens on public groups and public pages on Facebook. Not on profiles, not anywhere else, but public groups and public pages on Facebook. That's all it has. And here, because then the other problem is, of course, to limit this to just Australian groups and pages. Now, for groups, that's quite difficult, but for pages, we can actually do that to a certain point. So what I'll talk to here is data from Australian Facebook pages that are public. And we've, over the period of the ban itself and a bit before and after, we've gathered data on activity on those pages, basically. So that's what I'm going to show you here. And that's what it looks like for the pages of news outlets in Australia. So you see there's the 18th of February here. And you see there's really right from the start there is an impact, although oddly enough there's still a little bit of posting that happens on Australian news pages for a little while. And we think that's because they were at that point experimenting with various loopholes. So rather than posting their news stories directly, they were posting them perhaps as bit.ly links or other kind of short links that Facebook might take a little while to work out. Or they might post, tweets, links to tweets that then link to the news stories. So some kind of secondary and tertiary way of linking to the piece that you've just published. So at first they were still able to get away with that, particularly on the first day. These are all by hours, so this is the first day, second day, third day, and so on. But gradually, Facebook cracked down on this more and more as well and closed those last remaining loopholes. And really, by the end of that period, there's practically no more content being posted to any of these pages at all, basically. But the problem here is that even if they were still able to post content to their own pages somehow, that content still simply wasn't visible to anyone trying to access it. So an outlet like the ABC might still be able to post something to its page, but that post is not visible to anyone else, basically. And that's what we see with the graph at the bottom, which shows interactions. So even though these articles are still being posted, interactions all the way through are virtually zero throughout this entire time. So essentially, from the 18th of February in the morning, around 7 o'clock or so, when this thing happens, there are no more interactions with Australian news pages on Facebook. Until finally, and I'll get to that in a minute, the whole thing is resolved and we get to a point where Facebook opens things up again on the 26th of February. So that's the impact. Basically, no more visibility, no more interaction of Australian news on Facebook, full stop. That's again, pretty drastic and pretty severe step to take, obviously, and it just shows the power of Facebook as a platform. Now, what we've then also done, though, and here I've got to say, Facebook's right, basically. We've then also looked at the activity, both posting activity at the top there and interaction activity at the bottom on Australian Facebook pages overall. That's the red line. The kind of teal turquoise line at the bottom there is what I've just shown you. So that's, again, interactions with Australian news pages, posting on Australian news pages and interactions with Australian news pages. But the red line is posts and interactions on Australian pages overall, independent of the topic. And what you see there is that you don't see anything. So activity on Facebook, both in terms of posting and in terms of interactions over the course of this period, basically continues as if nothing has happened. And that means that, yes, Facebook is, and I hate to admit it, but they're right. News does not play a significant role on Facebook in terms of activity and interactions. It doesn't make a dent. This is the period of the Facebook news ban. You do not see any change in how much people interact with Australian news pages just because, with Australian pages, sorry, just because Australian news pages no longer get any interactions. So much of what happens on Facebook is not news related. Yes, it might be an important news source for Australians, but if news is suddenly gone from the platform, well, okay, people will still use the platform just as much as they did before. So that's why Facebook can get away with what it's doing as well, because it's not significantly changing the user experience in that sense. And the only dip that you see there, by the way, that's just the weekend, when people are out and about in the Australian summer in February and just not spending that much time on Facebook. So yeah, Facebook is unfortunately right. They can do this, and most Australian Facebook users may not even notice because they're doing a lot of other things on Facebook, not so much engaging with news pages. And if there's a fewer news stories showing up in their Facebook feeds, well, it might even take them some time to notice that suddenly, hey, didn't there used to be news in my feed? Now there isn't. What's going on? But people might not really even notice that so much because they're not there for the news. They just get that serendipitously. That's something else we've talked about a few weeks ago. So that's why, yeah, Facebook can actually get away with that. What's also interesting, I won't spend too much time on this, is the kind of the impact, basically, just looking at some of the key links being shared as well. So these are the links per day that are being shared, the top 25 sites that are being linked to in the pre-ban, the ban, and the post-ban period, basically, as you see there. So from the left, the period before the ban, the days before the ban, then the time of the ban and the changes in the volume of links being shared, and then the post-ban period. And so, yeah, we're seeing that news outlets like ABC, like 7 News and others are still trying to post their links to Facebook, so it's not gone down to zero. It's not reduced by 100%, just by 87% in the case of the ABC and others. So they're still trying to post, but those posts are just not visible to anyone else, basically. Links to Google remain unaffected, and that became one of the ways to work around it as well. So rather than linking to your news story, you might link to a Google search for your news story. And that's what some people try to do, and that kind of worked, but only to a point. Links to YouTube also were unaffected, so the outlets that had pivoted to video and that had video content were sharing perhaps YouTube videos, but again, that only worked to a point. Bitly links were also down quite significantly, so those third-party URL shorteners, Facebook kind of noticed that people were trying to do that and reduced that as well. And oddly enough, the Epoch Times was not affected. And the Epoch Times, if you don't know, is a very weird fake news outlet, basically, run by Falun Gong. And that perhaps is just not classified as news by Facebook. So content from it was still circulating without much change. The top sites during the period of the ban were an odd kind of news.china.com.au site, which might have been a new launch because we didn't see it before the ban. Twitter went up almost to double the volume of tweets, of links to tweets that had been posted previously, and I think that is because people were basically sharing news stories by sharing links to tweets about news stories. So kind of a secondary kind of way of sharing them. And the interactions with that content, so what I've shown you were the links during this time, but where interactions went was, well, in the first place, there simply were no interactions with news pages, with links to news content anymore. That went down to, practically a 100% loss compared to pre-ban levels. Where we did see a lot of interaction was in news satire. So oddly enough, with everything else that they banned, news satire sites like the Batuta Advocate or others, they remained, and they were able then to say, well, we're the last news site in Australia that's still on Facebook, basically, and they made a lot of fun of that, obviously, of that fact. So they were having a great time making fun of the whole situation, but they really were the only thing that wasn't covered, and that's kind of odd because they are designed to look like a news site, of course. They post content that looks like news, but is, of course, similar to The Onion or other sites that you'll be aware of, kind of just designed to look like news, but totally humorous and satirical. But Facebook did not choose to ban that as well, so that's odd. Google, again, as a pathway to news, continued. And yeah, Bitly links were being posted, but only there was only 20% of the volume of engagement with Bitly links that there was previously, because Facebook kind of worked that out and said, well, that's news too, so we're not making those visible anymore either. At some point, food media came back. At first, food outlets like taste.com.au, which is basically a recipe magazine in Australia, its page was banned as well, because it's a magazine, I guess, so it's kind of news. That was reversed more quickly, so interactions didn't drop down quite as much. And yeah, YouTube again, interactions kind of remained because they were, because I guess Facebook didn't want to pick a fight with Google or Alphabet by banning links to YouTube being shared, I think. That's probably more about the politics between those two major platforms, that Facebook wasn't going to say, oh, we can't have YouTube links on our platform anymore because some of them might be news. So that's probably what happened there. And yeah, the sites that benefited most, that really gained in interactions, were things like the Batuta Advocate as a news satire, the Chaser, which is also news satire, which went up, as you see there, to 407% of its previous level. So that's where a lot of people went, not so much to get their news, but to just engage with something else that they perhaps hadn't engaged with so much before. So it went from what is that, about 8,000 engagements per day, interactions per day, to 35,000 interactions per day during that time. That's quite a significant improvement, obviously. Twitter, again, engagement there increased to 188% of previous levels. And really what's left of the leading kind of pages where engagement does happen are often lifestyle and food and sports type pages, basically. So that's where Facebook users went, where they engaged, when news was no longer available. And that's really a sign that the user base of Facebook is not necessarily all that interested in the news in the first place, but they'll go somewhere else and they'll use Facebook for other purposes if news is not available. And again, that's why Facebook can get away with what it did. So just wrapping that up then, to talk a little bit more about the aftermath of what then happened. Obviously, as you've seen from this, the ban was eventually reversed on the 26th of February. Of course, as always happens with these things, where you get some sort of compromise, everyone claimed victory. The government said, hey, yeah, we've successfully negotiated with Facebook to bring news back onto the platform, yay. And the treasurer at the time, so it's basically the equivalent of a finance minister in Europe, said, look, I've talked personally with Mark Zuckerberg, so that's of course always something that you can say as a politician, yeah, I've negotiated directly with the big boss, and he said to me, the restoring of pages will occur in the coming days. And yeah, so basically the government said, well, we pushed this through and we won in the end. Facebook has given up on the ban. Of course, the price for giving up on the ban was that the government has agreed not to what's called designate Facebook under the code. So in other words, basically saying, okay, we will pass this bill, but we will not include you as one of the platforms that's covered by the bill. So everyone else is, or other platforms are, but Facebook isn't. And all we're asking of Facebook is that you voluntarily negotiate with some news outlets in order to better share the revenue. So that's a very different story from being forced by law to negotiate, obviously. And that's done through what I've highlighted there, a series of amendments to the laws before they passed in Parliament. Now, what that means is ultimately that the negotiations that Facebook did then make with various news outlets were not covered by the law, did not have to adhere to the rules in the law, did not have to be publicly released. Facebook did not have to negotiate equally with a broad range of news outlets, but it could pick the ones that it would want to negotiate with. It could do all of this in secret without revealing each of the individual agreements that it had made, or even how much money it was paying these outlets. So it basically means that Facebook was now able to continue to operate with these arrangements in secret, rather than for any of them to be released and perhaps become precedent for similar laws elsewhere, or for similar negotiations at least elsewhere. Or even for one news outlet to know how the other news outlet has been negotiating with Facebook and how much money it's getting. So this is very much a settlement on Facebook's terms ultimately. Facebook remains the big player in all of this. And in the end, Facebook has paid, in the probably, we don't really know, in the tens of millions of dollars to a number of news outlets. And those news outlets have done stuff with that money. Sometimes it's just gone to the shareholders. Sometimes it's actually paid for new journalists or other innovation. But we don't know exactly how much it's paid to any one of them. We don't know if these will be ongoing payments, or if Facebook at some point says, well, that's enough, and we'll stop that now. We certainly, it hasn't negotiated evenly with all outlets. It's picked a number of the key ones in order to perhaps not have bad press about them from those outlets anymore either. And that might be the other effect, of course, that these negotiations might have. If Facebook suddenly pays tens of millions of dollars to your company, maybe your company chooses not to be so critical in its journalism anymore about you. So there's a whole bunch of things that we don't know, basically. Another thing is quite deeply problematic. And of course, Facebook says, well, we've won because the law now no longer covers us. We've just made our own negotiations, and I'm really, I'd say I'd agree with them, to be honest. I think they've very much managed by brute force ultimately, of course, but they've managed to get a deal that is very beneficial to them and not so beneficial to the government or to Australian news organizations. And yeah, maybe that's one of the most problematic things, is really that the money that they're now paying to news outlets does not need to be invested in journalism. It can go simply to the shareholders. It can go anywhere they like, basically. There's no requirement for that money to really go anywhere specific. So it's not like this will necessarily benefit Australian journalism. It might just benefit the company's bottom line, and that's it. Now, in fairness, a number of companies have hired new journalists and said that's from the Facebook money, but again, we don't even know how much money they're getting and whether they're investing all of that now in journalism or not. So there's a lot of, there continue to be a lot of unanswered questions about this, and not a great deal of transparency. And we're coming up now to the first, we've passed, in fact, the first anniversary of this, but we're coming up now actually to a review of the code as well, to see how well it's worked. So it'll be interesting to see what the views are on that, basically, from what is actually now a new government. We've had a change of government in the meantime, and how they might want to continue this process, or what they think they want to do with it. Meanwhile, quite a few governments have looked with interest to this development in Australia and have said, well, okay, that's interesting. And Canada's decided to basically do something very similar to the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. And that's kind of obviously why we get these kinds of questions now from the media in Canada as well. Well, is this just going to result in the same thing? Already, basically, Facebook and other platforms are making similar noises, and it's too early to say basically what will happen there. It's still got a little while to go. I think they're coming up to introducing the act, as they call it, the Online News Act, fairly soon into Parliament in Canada, but it remains to be seen exactly how that plays out, and whether Facebook does something quite similar to what they've done in Australia, and again, remove all Canadian news content from Facebook, or whatever else might happen there as well. But watch that space, basically. I think probably, hopefully, we'll see this show up in the international news too. I'm actually curious, did any of you come across news about the Australian news media, the Facebook ban? No? Yep, one person, I think, yeah. So yeah, I mean, you'd have to follow media policy quite closely, I think, to probably see it. But this is certainly being watched in the circles who are interested in this. And we do, we do see this in Canada now. We'll see how that plays out there, whether Facebook kind of just plays the same game or maybe takes a harder line even. Of course, it depends on how it thinks it can engage with the Canadian government as opposed to the Australian government as well. And there's a few other legislations around the world that are perhaps trying to do something quite similar. And in the end, really, the question is whether this is working and whether, the Australian government perhaps caved too quickly, whether they were giving too much space to Facebook and didn't push hard enough, or whether this whole idea ultimately of doing it in this way is in fact effective in the first place. So, yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with Canada. We do know in Australia, basically, we've now got this very strange compromise where, yes, Facebook is paying what for it are really limited amounts of money to news outlets. Those news outlets can do with that, to selected news outlets. Those selected news outlets can do with that money whatever they want, maybe invest in journalism, maybe not. And it benefits, if anything in the news, only the established, the old legacy media. That's where the contracts or where the negotiations have been made. So new startups, which are often the most innovative and the most interesting new news outlets, do not benefit from this. Smaller regional outlets do not benefit from this. Public broadcasters, I don't know if they've made if they've actually come to an arrangement with them now too, but they've not benefited from this very directly either, and that's also a problem because public broadcasting is, of course, a really important part of the media environment. So there are some really significant questions about whether this is ultimately the right way. But again, what I'm trying to show with this case study, obviously, is also that these platforms, Facebook, but also Google, which has in this kind of just, in a sense, hidden behind Facebook for most of the time and not been particularly visible other than these few early threats, perhaps. Facebook, Google, other major platforms are ultimately very powerful in their negotiating positions, and they can, if they want to, of course, take these really drastic measures to just say, well, if you do that, then we'll just remove news content. So they have a lot of negotiating power ultimately, and that is, I think, a really significant problem, obviously. And if it's not paying for the news, then obviously it may well be other aspects of their operation, whether it is, dealing with mis and disinformation or not dealing with it, as the case may be, dealing with hate speech and abuse. And again, without wanting to repeat myself, we're seeing quite a bit of that play out with Twitter at the moment as well, where hate speech and abuse is back, mis and disinformation is back. A lot of people have been restored to the platform who spread everything from outright fascism to homophobia and sexism and so on. And it's difficult for governments to push back against that because ultimately these platforms have a lot of power and are not easy to control through government intervention and regulation. We'll see whether the noises being made right now by the European Commission, particularly about Twitter and the increase in hate speech on the platform, whether that results in any kind of new regulation or attempts to deal with the issues there, or whether Twitter and Elon Musk will just say, well, we don't care about Europe, we're in America, and we believe in free speech above everything. So I think these are really some of the absolutely pressing challenges that we're confronting with all of this. And that actually goes beyond, ultimately, the question only of news and the question of public debate and public communication much more broadly as well. So that's where I'll leave it for today. Now, as I say, next week we'll try and wrap up all of that. And for that, again, it's the final chapter of the textbook as well that we'll work with. All right, let's leave it there. Thank you all, and see you one more time next week.